Welcome to our Finance Toolbox series provided by Frost Brown Todd and its affiliate SBT Project Finance Advisors and presented on CDFA TV. The title of this episode is Water Finance 101. My name is Christina Wigg and I'm an associate in the Environmental Litigation Group with Frost Brown Todd. Joining me today is Jerry Routh from Ohio Environmental Protection Agency and Steve Robertson from Frost Brown Todd. Jerry is the Chief of the Division of Environmental and Financial Assistance, overseeing the Office of Financial Assistance, which administers to the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, and the Wastewater Compliance Assistance Unit. Jerry also oversees the Office of Compliance Assistance and Pollution Prevention, which administers compliance assistance to small businesses, the Recycling and Litter Prevention Grant Program, the Ohio Materials Marketplace, and Encouraging Environmental Excellence Program. Steve serves as principal in the Frost Brown Todd Government Relations subsidiary, Civic Point. In addition to his government relations work, he also is active in the firm's public-private partnership consulting practice. Steve has previously served in public sector's position as the Commissioner of Kentucky's Department for Local Government and as the Chairman of the Kentucky Infrastructure Authority. Today, we're going to explore some of the financing options available for water infrastructure for state and local governments. What exactly are we referring to when we say water infrastructure? Water infrastructure includes things such as stormwater, both the gray water, water from manholes, gutters, retention basins, as well as stormwater from wetlands, swales, and rain gardens, as well as wastewater collection systems, such as the sewer pipes, pump stations, and storage tanks, and the wastewater treatment plants themselves. In addition to the drinking water systems, those infrastructure items which assist in obtaining water, such as the wells or reservoirs, storing the water, such as tanks and surface impoundments, treatment plants, and the transmission and distribution system, all the pipes and pumps. We will discuss funding options for these types of infrastructures, including federal and state funding options. We'll briefly mention bonds and discuss the public-private partnerships, also known as P3s. And we're now going to turn it over to Jerry to talk a bit about the state and federal funding options.
Well, thanks, Christina. You gave a really good definition of water infrastructure, and across the country, in every state, the cost associated with water infrastructure is really, really large. I mean, it's in the neighborhood of tens of billions of dollars per state and hundreds of billions of dollars if you look across the country at what the infrastructure needs are for water, wastewater, and stormwater. And because these projects are so expensive, they have to be financed. And so it's all the more important that communities and utilities try to identify the best financing source for them for their water infrastructure projects. So today, we're going to talk about three main sources of where communities and utilities can go for that financing. The first that I'm going to talk about is just some state grant and loan programs that could be available within any state in the country. The second main source of funding that we want to talk about is the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund programs. The third source of capital funds that could be available from the federal government are those that come from the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. And then lastly, we're going to kind of wrap that up by doing a little bit of comparison between those different sources of funds and also talk about how they compare with bond financing. Let's first start off with the state grant and loan programs. So almost every state has some money available for water and wastewater infrastructure projects. These are state funds, and they can come from monies that have either been appropriated directly by that state legislature or from a statewide voter-approved bond issuance. A lot of states have these, and they may also have a state revolving loan program that preceded the SRF programs that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So, for example, in my home state of Ohio, there is a water infrastructure bank, the Ohio Water Development Authority, that was created almost 50 years ago with a legislative appropriation. And with that money, they run a state revolving fund program that loans out money for infrastructure at market rates. We also have a Public Works Commission in Ohio that administers about $175 million a year in voter-approved bond money. And then thirdly, we have a newer program that we call the H2 Ohio program that administers about $172 million in legislatively approved grant money each year. So that's just an example of some of the state grant and loan programs that are available in Ohio. And I know from talking with my partners in other states that most states have similar programs. These funds are often focused on specific types of problems, such as like unsewered areas, or for the correction or replacement of lead service lines, or for the correction of home sewage treatment systems, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever is the major issue in the state, that's where the state grant and loan funds are directed. And they also can be especially helpful for smaller communities. Typically, the state grant and loan programs are not really geared towards the super large projects that might come from the much, much larger utilities. And then lastly, within this group, I'm also going to mention a federal program. So it's not a state grant or loan program, it's a federal program, but I want to fit it in this grouping because the applicants typically are smaller communities. And that is the program that's offered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, which administers about $1.5 billion in funds a year that are available for water and wastewater infrastructure. So these might be the first source of funds that communities might look for when they're contemplating a water infrastructure project, because of the fact that they're, by and large, they are grant funds that are available. So they might be the best source to go to first. Next, we're going to move on to a discussion about the clean water and the drinking water state revolving fund programs, or what we call the SRF programs, state revolving funds. I'm going to talk about these together because although they're separate programs, they basically mirror one another. They're very similar, and they can be one of the most powerful sources of funding that's available in each state. The SRF programs are state revolving funds, the revolving loan programs that are seeded with federal funds and state matching funds. These funds are loaned out at below market interest rates to communities and utilities for eligible projects. The loans are then repaid back into the fund and therefore are eligible to be used over and over again. And that's where the name revolving loan program comes from. Each state in the country has a clean water and a drinking water SRF program. And because they're authorized under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, the basic structure of these SRF programs is the same from state to state, although there are some differences from one state to another. These programs have existed for over 3 decades for the Clean Water SRF program and over 20 years for the Safe Drinking Water Act SRF program. As I mentioned, they are partially capitalized by the federal government, but they're run by states. And it really has become a very successful model for a revolving loan program. They are designed to be administered in perpetuity. So these are dedicated funds within each state to be used only for the eligible purposes under the Clean Water SRF and the Drinking Water SRF. These below market interest rates can save millions of dollars in interest payments. And since the loans are almost universally paid off by the community's water or wastewater user charge system, it keeps the rates affordable for residents. And that's why this is so important. As I mentioned at the very beginning, these projects are so very expensive, millions and millions of dollars of capital improvements. And so if you can borrow at the lowest rates possible, they're going to save lots of money. Generally, the SRF programs are limited to public water and wastewater infrastructure, although there are some exceptions. And each state establishes their interest rate structure, any discounts that they may want to offer, and any special features that they have. As I said, probably the lowest interest rates that you're going to find. Often, these programs are co-administered by the environmental agency within the state, as well as a finance authority. If that's the way it's set up in a particular state, the finance authority will be the one that actually disperses the money, collects the repayments, manages the funds from a financial standpoint, and perhaps leverages the program. About 30 to 50 of the state SRF programs leverage their programs, which is to say that they sell bonds to raise funds to be loaned out and use the existing repayment stream as security and repayment source for the bonds. This can be a really powerful tool for the state SRF programs. Most of these programs offer terms of 20 years, but can go as much as 30 or perhaps even beyond as far as the loans terms that are offered to the applicants. There is no minimum amounts, and but some states do have a maximum amount of the loan that they can make. What I have seen is that many of these programs have gotten so large that they can accommodate loans in the tens, if not the hundreds of millions, to some of these large communities for their infrastructure projects. The eligibilities are quite broad in what the loan funds can be used for. Virtually any new or replacement infrastructure within the water, wastewater, and stormwater arenas is probably an eligible project. They can cover the entire project cost, but they're also commonly used as co-funding with other sources. And that's a good thing. That can just spread the money out to more and more projects. Typically, once a loan is awarded, funds are dispersed and on a reimbursement basis, and then an adjustment is made to the loan amount at the project closeout. That's the typical way that an SRF program operates. The SRF programs often run on an annual cycle and accept nominations, or what some people call pre-applications, once a year. Those projects are put on what the state calls its intended projects list. So there is a certain amount of wanting to start early and work with the state revolving fund program if a community or a utility is interested. Last thing about the state revolving funds is that there's typically a lot of information, good information, that's available online, and there are dedicated staff that are available to answer questions. So if communities and utilities are interested in pursuing either a clean water SRF or a drinking water SRF loan, they really can easily find out who to talk to within their state and get some more information on that. Next, I'm going to switch over and talk about a little bit newer program, but one that is equally powerful when considering financing for water infrastructure projects. And that is a program called the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or what people refer to as WIFIA. The Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act of 2014, or WIFIA, established the WIFIA program. So the federal act created a program which goes by the same name. The WIFIA program is a federal credit program, and it is administered by US EPA for eligible water and wastewater infrastructure projects. The WIFIA appropriations by Congress are not for loans or loan guarantees themselves, but to provide loss reserves against which loans and guarantees may be granted. So it's fundamentally a little bit different than the state revolving fund programs, but at the same time, still a powerful source of money. For water infrastructure projects, the reserves needed may be only 1% of the loan total. Thus, a federal appropriation of about $50 million could allow for over $5 billion in loans from the U.S. Treasury. It's a federal program, as I mentioned. It's administered by U.S. EPA. The financing is offered at or above the U.S. Treasury rate of a similar maturity. U.S. Treasury rates are typically lower than bond issuances, so it's an attractive source of funding. The WIFIA program is a federal program, and it's administered directly by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Financing is at or above the U.S. Treasury rate of a similar maturity. U.S. Treasury rates are generally below bond market rates, so it's an attractive source of financing. Like the SRF programs, loans are secured and repaid by the revenue from local water or wastewater user charges. The WIFIA program can fund up to 49% of the total project costs. That number comes from the WIFIA Act itself. So the other 51% will need to come from other funding sources. SRF co-funding with WIFIA is not only possible, but it is encouraged. The maximum final maturity for a WIFIA loan is 35 years from substantial completion of the project. The WIFIA program also offers that payments can be deferred for up to 5 years from substantial completion, as well as the repayments can be, they offer a highly flexible repayments schedule. So the repayments can be sculpted to fit the particular community. These last three factors are very attractive features of the WIFIA program. The fact that the maturity can be up to 35 years and that repayments can be deferred for 5 years, and the sculpting of the repayments. To date, the WIFIA program has closed 39 loans totaling about $7.2 billion. So if you do the math on that, you'll find out that WIFIA financings are quite large, averaging about $195 million per financing. So just to do a little bit of a comparison between the state revolving fund programs, or the SRFs, and the WIFIA program, I'll just review a couple of the key differences between them. So interest rates. With the SRF programs, they are offered at below market interest rate, generally below what the U.S. Treasury would offer. The WIFIA program offers U.S. Treasury rates. The terms of a SRF program would generally be about 30 years, whereas the term of a WIFIA loan can go perhaps up to 35. If you look at an annual basis, the amount of funds that could be available across the country, the SRF programs combined would have about $10 billion worth of lending capacity and growing. The WIFIA program, about half of that, about $5 billion in lending capacity. SRF programs can fund the entire project cost, whereas the WIFIA program can only fund up to 49% of the project cost. The SRF programs are administered by the individual states, whereas the WIFIA program is administered directly by US EPA. As far as large loans, or what I sometimes call mega-sized loans, those that might be, say, $100 million or greater, the SRF program in a particular state may or may not be able to accommodate a loan that size. The WIFIA program often accommodates loans that size. As we indicated, the average loan so far through WIFIA is about $195 million. What about small loans, or loans that are, say, less than $10 million? Those are very common through the state SRF programs, whereas with the WIFIA program, they can only accommodate loans less than 20 million if they're bundled with others. So we've talked about the SRF programs. We talked a little bit about the WIFIA programs. Now we're going to just have, I'm going to talk about some other thoughts about those two programs, as well as comparing those a little bit with bond financing. The SRF programs and the WIFIA program can be complementary, which means that they can co-fund projects, and that might be a good way for a large project to go, is to get the 49% from WIFIA and to get the remainder if it was available from the state revolving fund. Unlike bonding or private financing, the program features might be a little more uniform and maybe a little bit more transparent to potential borrowers, because there's so much information that's available on the internet about these programs. The WIFIA and SRF programs have guaranteed below market interest rates, probably better than what most entities are going to find if they were to sell bonds. The WIFIA program is relatively new. The first loan was closed in early part of 2018, but they've been closing a lot of loans ever since then. The SRF programs have a longer history, over 30 years with the Clean Water SRF program and about 20 years with the Drinking Water SRF program. The WIFIA program is reliant on federal appropriations for those loss reserves. As I mentioned, it's not a revolving loan program. However, both programs have pretty strong support in Congress as far as appropriations, and continued funding is likely. So I always like to advise communities to first take a look at the state grant and loan programs that might be available to them. The next tier that people may want to look at is the SRF programs, whether it's the Clean Water or the Drinking Water SRF program, as well as the WIFIA program. I would encourage communities, utilities, their consultants or advisors to contact people who run the SRF programs and the WIFIA programs and ask them about the project that they have in mind. People should do their own research. Each project, each community, each state is different. So a successful project in one location at one point in time may not necessarily mean that a similar project will get financing at a different point in time. Likewise, a unsuccessful application in one state at one point in time doesn't necessarily mean that similar projects would be unsuccessful. They're really unique. And so communities and utilities, consultants, and their advisors really should reach out and talk to the people that run the programs to get the best information possible. So I hope that some of this information has been helpful, and will encourage communities and their consultants to take a look at the state grant and loan programs, as well as the state SRF programs that are available, and the WIFIA program, because these are all viable, if not the preferred alternative to obtain low interest financing for water infrastructure projects. So with that, I will turn it back over to Christina.
Thanks, Jerry. Before we go to panel questions, I wanted to mention that in addition to federal and state funding resources, a lot of water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure is financed with bonds, usually secured by both a pledge of user fees and covenant to maintain fees at rates that cover debt services and maintenance. P3s, or public-private partnerships, are now being used in conjunction with all of these funding sources. Steve, would you mind providing some insight on exactly what P3s are and perhaps provide an example from Kentucky?
Sure. So at its base level, a P3 is a customizable contractual agreement between a public agency and a private sector entity to design, build, finance, operate, maintain, any combination of those things, some sort of public infrastructure asset. In Kentucky, we're really blessed to have a very flexible law around P3s that goes beyond what most states look at, which are transportation related projects. In Kentucky, it's very broad and incorporates all levels of infrastructure, and it also provides a framework for local governments themselves to pursue P3 opportunities. One example that we've been working on over the last several months, we started pre-COVID, and we're about to finish up the process, is a wastewater treatment facility in a small community just west of Louisville, Kentucky, with a population of about 2,800. And many people are always curious, can a P3 dip down to lower financing levels? And we're here to say yes, they can. This particular project is ultimately going to end up being about an $8.5 million project. It's a construction of a new wastewater treatment plant that where the need arose due to an economic development announcement with a new steel mill that was going to encroach on the city's current wastewater treatment plant site. And the city, in its desire to explore every opportunity before them, really with pressures to deliver the best rate structure to their citizens as possible, decided to explore P3. And so ultimately, this particular project will be delivered as Kentucky's first local government P3 under this new law that was passed in 2016. So I think we're excited to see more communities take that approach. I'm sure I've seen, and Jerry's seen, the long line of applicants that come into SRFs to secure funding for their project. And with the need that's out there, SRFs just can't fill the need year in and year out. So I think as a lot of these deferred maintenance issues across Kentucky, across the nation, are placing additional pressures on these communities, and the limited amount of government funding that's available, we're interested to see if more communities do like this one community did, and maybe open their minds to different approaches.
Thanks, Steve. So to kind of build on the comment you said with a long line of applicants, given the stressed world and U.S. economy right now, would you say that there's more or less opportunity now for the private P3 investments in infrastructure?
Yeah, it will. And Jerry mentioned earlier some dollar amounts around the need. You know, I was looking at the infrastructure report card that the American Society for Civil Engineers publishes. And I guess the American Water Works Association projected the drinking water need over the next 25 years to be over $1 trillion. And they've also projected that the wastewater needs over the next couple decades is over $270 billion. In Kentucky, drinking water needs are in excess of 8 billion, wastewater needs are in excess of 6 billion. Kentucky's annual budget is about 10 to 11 billion dollars. So do the math. They would have to basically forego every other priority of government in the Commonwealth of Kentucky for 2 consecutive years to meet the need, and that's not going to happen. But yeah, the need is huge, and people are going to have to start looking through these different programs to assemble the funding package to get their projects off the ground.
Thank you. Jerry, do you have anything to add to that?
Just want to echo, I think that what Steve indicated, that need, the demand is so enormous that there isn't going to be a single source of funding that's going to be able to handle all this. I think the way that I look at it is the SRFs have a place, WIFIA's got a place, P3 definitely has a place, perhaps a growing place, and private bond financing is got a place. It's going to take all of these sources and maybe more in order to have adequate capital to provide the financing that we need for water and wastewater in the United States.
Jerry, do you see any long-term trends in the federal support for the State Revolving Fund and Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act programs?
That's a good question. The SRF programs have been around, as I indicated, for several decades. The clean water SRF over 30 years, the drinking water over 20. They have received federal appropriations every year since they were created. And so they benefit from strong support from Congress. The WIFIA program is a much newer program. but it was created because of a perceived limitation on the SRF program. So it's a newer program. It has received congressional support each year since its creation. These are largely viewed as successful programs that can help a lot of communities with a reasonable amount of federal investment. So I think there's going to be continued support for them, and perhaps even increased support for the SRFs and for the WIFIA program.
Thanks. And Steve, this kind of goes back to the P3 question and the example that you provided. Given your recent experience in Kentucky, can we effectively use private capital and P3 models for small, under $25 million projects?
Yeah. I think the example that we just discussed clearly demonstrates that lower level projects can certainly go through the pipeline on a P3. The challenge is going to be finding the investors that are looking for projects of that size. But the good news is Kentucky, they clearly exist.
This question is actually for both of you. Would you have different advice for a community with a $5 million project versus a larger community with a $100 million project? I'll pass it to Jerry first.
Okay. Well, since my background is with the state and federal funding programs, that's what I'll speak to. For the smaller project, I would probably recommend that they look for the state grant and loan programs first, and then go to the SRF programs and see what's available through them. And then perhaps the third option would be the WIFIA program as far as the state and federal funding opportunities. The larger loan, say the greater than 100 million, that's a different story. The funds are probably not going to be available through the state grant and loan programs. They may not be available through the SRF, depending on the size of the SRF program in that state. The WIFIA program, on the other hand, could accommodate a loan of that size. So smaller communities, smaller loans. As far as the state and federal funding sources, I would probably advise them to go to the SRF program, and perhaps the larger ones may want to take a look at the WIFIA program.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I'll echo everything that Jerry just recommended. Communities need to explore every option that's available to them on funding, and certainly if they have the interest in thinking outside the box, they should put P3s on that list of options that they explore. Who knows? They might be surprised by what it comes back with.
Thank you, Jerry and Steve, for sharing this information with our audience today, and thank all of you for joining us as well. This video was provided by Frost Brown Todd and its affiliate SBT Project Finance Advisors and presented on CDFA TV.